Hi, welcome to Murf+E Unfiltered, Zero BS Biz Talk. I'm Kathleen Murphy, your host, and I'm here today with Charlotte McPherson, my co-host. How are you, Charlotte?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I've wanted to have you on as a guest for a long time, and this is show 45, so I've been doing this for a little while, so I'm sorry that it's taken so long to get you in here, but, you know, there's no time like the present, right?
Exactly.
When I was thinking about the topic that I wanted to cover with you, because we've known each other for quite a while now, I picked a topic that would be in keeping with your experience as a leader. And one of the things as a component that is associated, as we both know, about leadership is taking risks. So today we're going to be talking about taking more risks and why don't you is the topic for this. And I'm just going to read the overview here for this topic, and then we're going to dive in. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Excellent. So a limited amount of people enjoy taking risks, although some thrive on doing so. What prevents more people and leaders from experiencing the opportunity upside of risk-taking? So we know that there are a variety of risk tolerance levels, and it can go from people being completely frightened and never wanting to take any risks to people that jump out of planes, perhaps even without a parachute, and somehow think that they're going to be fine, and then everything in between. It's difficult to know, perhaps at some point early on, typically in someone's career, what maybe level of risk taking you're going to be at. And I think it's something that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that it's fluid. It changes over time based on experiences. There are also, as we know, different outcomes from taking risks, and you and I have both experienced the wonderful joys and outcomes that have been incredibly positive from taking risks. And we've also probably both experienced the downsides to perhaps taking risks that maybe weren't mitigated or maybe well thought through just based on inexperience, or maybe not having calculated quite well enough in terms of maybe what would happen that could be the downside of a possibility of taking a risk. We also know that our society is fairly risk adverse, and some of that has to do with the fact that our society is so litigious and people are afraid that they're going to get sued. So they tend to maybe be a little less risk tolerant for that reason. So let me ask you a question to kind of lead off this discussion. And the first question is, when did you realize that you could become more comfortable with risk taking?
Yeah, I would say probably in the last 10 years or so. It does take time and practice. I use an analogy of sort of a ladder, right? If you're afraid of heights, you're not going to jump right to the top of the rung. You're going to take incremental steps over time, and I think that's how it's really evolved for me.
Right.
And I think just over time, in seeing some wins, and it helps build on that.
Exactly. What was the first risk that you took potentially which turned out well, or maybe the opposite? I'm hoping it turned out well, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. Well, I will say the one that turned out well for me is, within my career, I have an accounting degree. I wanted to get into finance, and I did. Bentley,
Yes.
Bentley alum. And so as I started my career in accounting, I had an opportunity to actually transition to technology, which was a little outside my comfort zone. I don't have a technology background or a degree, but I had an opportunity working on a project that we had at the time in my team, and they said, we need someone to take this over the finish line. And so I had to jump out of my day-to-day and try something new. And it really launched my technology career, which then lasted about 13 years.
Right. Well, somebody obviously recognized something in your abilities that allowed them to take a risk on you, to come to you, someone without a technology background, to pick up on a project like that directed and changed the trajectory of your career, which is really phenomenal.
Yeah.
And when you're guiding others, because you've been a leader for a long time, and when you're guiding people through situations that are going to require them to take risks, how do you go about doing that? What's your method? Do you have a method?
Well, I think it's really gauging where they are with their level of risk taking. As I said, some folks are ready, like you said, jump right in, jump out of the plane. Other folks, you you want them to experience some of those small wins if they're
Right.
risk averse. And so I
Right.
think that's really what I try to do, is assess sort of where their head's at, what they're looking to do.
Right.
And then, we talk through, like, what are the things, what are the options that they want to consider, and let them choose, right?
them
It's,
choose.
yeah, it's really because ultimately they have to be comfortable with it.
So giving them choices
Yeah.
is what you're saying, and then seeing how they make a decision to make a choice. And based on the choice that they're making,
Exactly.
whether they're kind of at the beginning stages of having very low risk tolerance to maybe they're the one who's jumping out of the airplane, or maybe they're in between. And then based on that, you can then further guide them with risk taking going forward in the future.
Exactly. Especially if it's someone you're just getting to know.
Right.
You really want to establish a little bit of trust there and allow them to, assess where they're at, as I said. And then once we talk through it, I can gauge that, and then we continue working together. So,
Right.
They tend to come back and say, oh, either, that was successful, or I was a little uncomfortable, or didn't go exactly as planned. And then you adapt. from there.
Exactly. So you set them up for success. You have some early confidence wins for them, and then you just keep rolling with that.
Yeah.
I like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So for me, in terms of when I think about when I started becoming comfortable with taking risks, it was in my late 30s. So I was in a position where I was overseeing a decent-sized team. It was a global team, and there were some spots on the team that needed to be added to. And that was a little frightening because I hadn't necessarily hired people outside of the United States before. Although people are people, there are different factors that you need to take into consideration, as you know,
Yeah.
having global experience yourself from a leadership perspective. And I was concerned that I didn't know enough in terms of, were there things that I might not be taking into consideration in terms of where they were in the world, in terms of how their experience and where they were, how that might impact their decision making. But I knew that I had to trust my instinct, my gut instinct. So I was basing it upon the kind of questions that I was asking them, what their responses were, to figure out and assess whether they were the right people for the team. Also, at that time was when I probably started appreciating risk mitigation and understanding that I needed to take steps in order to, if I was going to do something risky, think about what was the process that I was going to need to go through and not skip any of those steps. Because if I did, I was going to potentially get myself into trouble. And then I would say giving advice to others was sort of something that made me a little uncomfortable because it was requiring risk on my part. Was I giving them the right advice? I didn't want to steer somebody in the wrong direction,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You don't want to do that. So that was a little scary for me. But that all kind of came together for me in my late 30s, and I've been honing that all those sort of areas ever since. And from a sort of thinking perspective in terms of about our society, we know that it's fairly conservative, just because, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about just our society being so litigious. Not a great thing, unfortunately. But I will take it upon myself to challenge myself from a risk perspective. I'm sure you do the same, so we'll get into that in a little bit in terms of, like, how do you go about doing that? What's something other than risk mitigation that you could apply? And then I like to also point out to people, when it comes to the topic of risk, making sure that you're not measuring your success of your risks based on others. I think it's got to be an individually based sort of like sport, if you will. And you can't also base on, well, so-and-so completed this, whatever it is, fill in the blank, in X period of time. That timeline is irrelevant. Your timeline is going to be way different than somebody else's, right?
Yeah.
And for the people that we're working with, that we're helping. So everybody's circumstances and professional or personal journey is different. So don't put pressure on yourself, is what I tell people.
Yeah. And I would also say not get so tied to the outcome.
I like that.
What else did you learn along the
Right.
way? Folks feel like, if they took a risk and it didn't end up exactly how they wanted, there's always something you can take from it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where folks, if they get discouraged, I try to just redirect them back to there's something you can always take from, even if it didn't go exactly as planned.
Exactly.
Rather than consider it, hey, I took a risk and it failed.
Right.
there's something that they can take forward.
In fact,
know?
I'm curious to get your opinion on this, but I've often told people, if you're not challenging yourself and taking enough risks, you're not learning, you're not growing. And I want you to be taking risks and making mistakes, because that's when you're going to have your biggest growth periods. If you're playing it too safe, I almost don't want somebody on my team like that. I want them to be taking those calculated risks, but also pushing the envelope a little bit, because I think that's the only way that you're going to get to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, we've all had to stretch outside of our comfort zone, right, to take a step forward potentially, and even if it's a small step.
Right.
I think folks think of risks as it has to be this monumental shift, and that's why they get so apprehensive. Where a risk for you and I could be completely different. What
Sure.
I see as a risk and what you see as a risk.
Right.
So allowing folks to figure out what is the risk that they're willing to take, but helping them to take it, just that one step.
Exactly.
Can go a long way.
It certainly can, absolutely. So have you learned to become more comfortable with your personal and professional risk taking? And then can you give me an example or two of how you went about doing that? What do those look like, those risks? And
Yeah, I definitely have. I think, like I mentioned, probably in the last 10 years or so is really where I felt it. And personally, I'm taking a risk now. I'm actually launching a coaching business in addition to my core 9-to-5 job, and I'm looking to do one-on-one coaching with leaders. I've done it through my current role, and so branching out on your own is definitely a risk factor, and it's different, when you're the one running your business versus working for someone else. And so for me, that's been my most recent personal
That's
risk.
huge.
And I'm excited though. I'm learning. I'm having someone actually help and coach me along the way. She helps coaches establish their businesses.
Perfect.
And without that though, having some guidance, just like we guide others, we also need guidance if it's something not in our wheelhouse, right? So
without a doubt.
so it's been a really fun experience so far, and
I'm so glad.
yeah,
I can't wait to see where you're going to take this. This is going to be so fun.
Yeah,
and I have a feeling we'll probably be working together at some point too.
Yeah, that sounds great. Definitely.
That's so good.
Yeah.
And then how do you go about measuring the outcome from the risks that you've taken? What does that look like?
I think for me, it's always been in hindsight. I think it's really hard when you're in it to really see how rewarding or not, or how this is going to pan out. So I think, always taking that time to reflect.
Yes.
And I think for me, it's did I learn something? Did it move me in the direction I'm looking to go? And again, it may not be the exact outcome that I wanted, but I'm okay with that.
Right.
I think that's what folks can help folks increase their risk levels.
Do you think risk taking is good for everyone?
I do, in the sense of, again, I think it's the scale of risk. I think, like you said, I do feel like if you're looking for growth, risks come with that.
Yes.
And so I think it is for everyone. Now, will everyone actually take advantage of that is a different story.
Right.
But I do think there's growth there. And I think if folks understand, what that serves them, again, in that hindsight, what did they learn?
So you've been an executive leader yourself for a number of decades at this point. And was there a time when you were risk adverse, and then what prompted you to consider changing? So you said it's been within the last 10 years that perhaps you've maybe sort of made some shifts in your mindset in terms of thinking about taking either different or more risks. What prompted you to do that?
Well, so within, as I mentioned, I started in operations. I went to technology, and about 4 years ago, I'd been in technology. I loved it. I was in there, like I said, for about 13 years, and I had the opportunity to come back and lead an operations team. And that was one of those moments where I reflected back from when I left operations, I went to technology, and I said, I can do this again. So I think if you have some of those wins behind you, like I said, the reflection part, it gives you the confidence to say, okay, I'm going to take this risk and do it. And it's been rewarding. I think if I hadn't gone to technology and taken this role, I don't know if I'd be as effective as I feel I am now.
Okay.
So, I just, you'll take those
remarkable.
nuggets with you. Yeah.
Well, that's just it, right?
Yeah.
And if someone had told you, hey, Charlotte, in X number of years, you've got this accounting degree, but you're going to be doing something wildly different than you are right now, you probably wouldn't have even believed them. That probably would have sounded incredulous.
Right, exactly. What I do find, though, now is, I have 2 daughters, and they're 26 and 24, and they both went to college, have degrees, and are doing something different, than what they necessarily went to school for. And I think that that's happening more now. And I think we're allowing folks that, maybe went to school for something, and, hiring practices have changed. So I think
Exactly.
for me, yeah, I would have said I never would imagine. I don't have a technology degree. I can't possibly do it. But I think now it's actually with, folks getting out of school now, it's a lot different, which is a great thing.
It's
good.
And you've been a tremendous role model for your daughters to be able to show that without just saying, you need to stick with the degree that you have and go find a job independent of the results that you're getting. So good for you. I love that. So before I was a leader, I was in a place where, especially in my 20s, I was incredibly risk adverse. And it was incredibly risk adverse because my confidence was low. I really didn't know what I wanted to do in my early to mid 20s. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that someone said, hey, I'd like you to consider going into the technology space. And it happened to be marketing focused. So I thought, well, the marketing part, I can handle. The technology part, I'm not so sure about. But 20 plus years later, I was still in that field. But I'm really glad somebody decided to take a risk on me. But it was really scary because I was so concerned about making mistakes and what I didn't know that sometimes it felt like it was paralyzing. So at some point, I had to basically have a talk with myself and say, you got to get over this. You just got to try it, and if you fail, it's okay. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? I'm not doing brain surgery, open heart surgery. Someone isn't going to die if I make a mistake with one of my decisions, right?
Exactly.
So that was really helpful, and I figured I'd have nothing really to lose and everything to gain if I just kept pushing myself. So the more I pushed myself, the more I understood that it was fine to just keep going, and I would figure it out at some point. I would say also it's critical to sort of go about, and this is something that I do with my leadership and executive and business and sports team clients, is I ask a lot of questions. And that comes from my training, having a degree in journalism, but also just being an inquisitive and curious person. I always say that you should always try to be curious. If you go into having a conversation with somebody, make sure that you're asking them questions. Just a little bit of a side note, but nothing irks me more than going into a conversation with somebody, or even having a lunch or dinner or coffee with somebody, and they don't ask you a single question. I'm baffled by that. Has that ever happened to you?
It has, not to that degree, but yes, you can tell when someone's really interested in you and the conversation versus telling you their story.
Yes.
And so it should be conversational where, I learn more about you, you learn more about me, and
Balanced.
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit of a balance.
Yeah.
That's just a pet peeve of mine. So I always think that people should be asking questions. And then I also talk to my clients a lot about communication and making sure that their communication is really strong, and dealing with those communication challenges that they might be having versus running away from them. And because communication is hard, this is something that isn't easy for most people. I would also say that making decisions and becoming more comfortable with them, which has to do with risk taking, because a lot of risk taking is about making a decision to do this or that, and just becoming more confident over time. And you've got to just at some point decide, okay, I'm not going to question everything that I'm considering doing. And then also thinking about evaluating future options and team members. I was having a conversation recently with one of my clients who was talking about the possibility that they might be needing to change their team and members on it, and they're not accustomed to really having to make that kind of consideration, but having to guide them through that is going to be something that I'm going to need to do. But that's a huge risk.
Oh yeah,
right.
Well, because it's people, right? It's their
people.
job,
That's right.
And so you're altering the course potentially of their career, and
right.
So it's something you don't take lightly.
No.
So it makes sense to kind of pause and do that. But ultimately, if you're there to make sure the team's successful, and if they're not being successful, another opportunity might actually be better for them. Right? It might not. It might help the team and them. So
that's
it really
right.
depends. Yeah.
That's an excellent way to think about it. You're maybe doing them a favor by suggesting that they might be happier or more productive someplace else. That's entirely a possibility, and I've seen that. So I've got some tips for people, and the first one is let's first have you rate yourself presently on your general risk tolerance level on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. Like, be honest with yourself. I tell people that. What is that? Now think about your rating. Is this a rating you would have had given yourself maybe 5 to 10 years ago? Think about that. Next would be, if your rating is different from the past, what are the contributing factors that have made you more or less risk tolerant? Because you could potentially slide backwards or maybe go forward. And then when you think about taking any type of risk, what is the first emotion you experience? What about you? What are maybe some tips that you would give to somebody who's saying, Charlotte, I need some advice in terms of being better at risk taking? What do you have to tell me?
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think really assessing, what level of risk can they take now?
Yes.
Right? They may want to be at a risk level
10.
8, 10, and maybe they're at a 3. So really, you're trying to bump them to a 4, to a 5.
Incrementally.
Yeah, exactly.
That ladder that
exactly.
you're talking about.
Yeah, it's just I don't think it's realistic to say to someone who's at a 3 that tomorrow you'll be a 10.
Right.
Because it might actually cause them to
Go back.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That-
So I would just say, pick the small wins. That's really what will help.
I love that. I love that. So another tip is, when you think about taking any type of risk, what is the first emotion you experience? I say that one again because I want to plant that seed. That's really critical. I'm underscoring that one. That's intentional in terms of asking that twice, because emotions are certainly tied to taking risks, and emotions can hold us back or they can help to propel us potentially forward. So that's something that's critical, which is why I wanted to underscore that and say it again. So if the emotion you're experiencing is contributing to having you be either risk adverse or at a lower risk tolerance level than you would like to be at, are there tangible and realistic ways you can adjust personally or professionally to increase your risk tolerance level? Only someone's going to be able to answer that question themselves.
Right.
And then another one is, assuming you want to increase your risk tolerance level, will doing so impact others you lead or who you depend on, or depend on you? If so, begin thinking about what are the risks you want to take that will impact others, and can you collectively come up with a solution to mitigate the risks you want to take? This will entail having to communicate your risk thinking to others, which is something I think sometimes people forget to do. It's all like kind of stored up in their head in terms of exactly what they're going to do. They think that they've had a conversation with you or everyone else when they haven't, and then they just come forward with this plan that they have, and everyone's looking at them thinking, what are you talking about? We
Right.
didn't talk about this. This is the first time I'm hearing about it.
Yeah.
Not the best approach. I would say try to avoid that.
Yeah, yeah. Communicating the why is important. That helps folks understand and actually support you.
Yes.
They know why you're doing what you're doing.
Precisely. And Simon Sinek is great at talking about the why and what is your why. So I think that's something, if someone hasn't heard of Simon Sinek, go Google and look up on YouTube Simon Sinek talking about your why or why. Love that. Risk-taking doesn't have to be associated with negative thinking. I think that is a common perception. But the way we individually think about it will contribute to whether we are willing to become more risk-tolerant. This is presuming you will be practical and clearly accepting the fact that you will need to think more broadly when you have about taking risks before. And that's something that I think takes time to get used to in terms of opening up the aperture in terms of your thinking. Would you agree on that?
I agree. I think a lot of times when you're first taking risks, the emotion is apprehension or fear.
Right.
And then as you progress, it becomes more of excitement and anticipating, what's next versus. So I've seen that shift in folks. And like you said, and then that depends on the level, what number you are, right? If you're 8 to 10, you're probably the person that's excited,
exactly,
and looking forward to it.
A little interesting fact: physiologically, the same response, your body doesn't know the difference between fear and excitement. So if you can keep that in your mind when you're fearful in a situation, when you're trying to make a decision, can you kind of back out of that, reverse that thinking, and say, this could be exciting, so that it helps to calm your physiology and helps you to think maybe a little bit more clearly versus being fearful and being sort of tightened up and not necessarily thinking about all the possibilities. That's
Did not
something
know that.
I know,
Learned
right?
something new.
Well, there you go. I love it. So we talked about not, being afraid to fail and then asking for support. We talked about, we haven't really talked about, but you don't have to be good at everything. I like to point that out to everybody. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Perhaps you probably don't want to be. Surround yourself with other really good people.
Yeah.
Delegate.
Yep.
Have fun. Experiment. Sometimes do something radical. I just had a conversation last week with some people that I'm coaching, a team that I'm coaching, and I said, you know what? Based on what's happening right now, we need to do something radical. And they said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, we might have to scrap everything that we're doing and do completely the opposite or just something so different. And they kind of looked at me like, are you kidding? And I said, no, I'm not kidding. And we're going to start in 3 days from now. And they did.
Nice.
And the results were phenomenal. So
that's great.
sometimes you have to do that.
Yeah.
I can't believe we've this time. I could talk to you for hours, and we have in the past.
Yeah.
But this has been so much fun talking to you about this particular topic.
Yeah.
And I'll look forward to having you back on the show. Any
100%.
last
Thank you so
minute
much for having
thoughts?
me.
Oh, you're
No,
very
I think
welcome.
this is such a relevant topic. Everyone, whether professionally or personally, facing fears and taking risks is everywhere. So I think it was So thanks again for having me.
Oh,
this was great.
My pleasure. Thanks for being here. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So thanks for being here with us today, and please come back to see us again on Murf+E Unfiltered, Zero BS Biz Talk. Take care, everyone. We'll see you at the next show.